Welcome to the London Psychometric Laboratory. I'm Konstantin Petridis, Director of the laboratory, and I will be narrating these slides on trait emotional intelligence. This video provides an introduction to the theory of trait emotional intelligence. It comprises three parts. First, it presents the background and definition of the term trait emotional intelligence, including its 15 constituent facets. Second, it presents the hierarchical structure of the construct, with the 15 narrow facets at the bottom, 4 broad factors in the middle, and global trait emotional intelligence at the apex of the hierarchy. Last, we close with a discussion of trait emotional intelligence as a theory and general interpretative framework. Let's start by providing a background to the construct of trait emotional intelligence. So, what is trait emotional intelligence? Trait emotional intelligence, or trait EI, is formally defined as a constellation of emotional perceptions assessed through questionnaires and rating scales. It is a theory that integrates the domains of personality traits, emotions, and intelligence broadly defined. Hence, trait emotional intelligence. Simply put, trait emotional intelligence is about people's perceptions of our emotional abilities. There are major individual differences in these perceptions. Some of us are highly confident that we can understand and manage our own and other people's feelings, while others feel overwhelmed and helpless. These perceptions are crucial because they have a direct influence on achievement, on mood, and on behavior throughout our lives. Trait emotional intelligence shows very weak correlations with IQ. This means that high trait EI people are equally likely to have high or low IQ scores. While trait emotional intelligence is a broader construct than IQ, they are both part of the general conception of radix intelligence, which I will introduce in a different video. An important conceptual innovation of trait emotional intelligence concerns its integration of the affective aspects of personality. Emotions are the most prominent aspect of personality. However, previous personality models overlooked their importance by either underplaying emotional variance or by scattering it across different personality dimensions. Trait emotional intelligence provides comprehensive coverage and scientific organization of the affective aspects of personality. The facet of assertiveness concerns how forthcoming or frank we are, as well as the degree to which we stand up for our rights. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on assertiveness. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low assertiveness scores have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, highly assertive people may come across as pushy or even aggressive. The facet of emotion expression concerns how confident you feel in expressing your feelings and moods to others. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on emotion expression. Like all trait emotional intelligence scores, both high and low scores on emotion expression have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals with high emotion expression may be perceived as transparent or histrionic, which means theatrical. In trait EI theory, emotion management concerns our confidence in managing other people's emotions and moods. It complements the facet of emotion regulation, which concerns our confidence in managing our own emotions and moods. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on the facet of emotion management. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low scores on emotion management have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals who score high on emotion management may be perceived by others as intrusive or manipulative. Emotion perception concerns your capacity to understand your own and other people's emotions. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low emotion perception scores. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low scores on emotion perception have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals who score high on emotion perception may have an excessive preoccupation with feelings and moods. The facet of emotion regulation concerns our confidence in managing our own emotions and moods. It complements the facet of emotion management, which concerns our confidence in managing other people's emotions and moods. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on emotion regulation. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low scores on emotion regulation have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals who score high on emotion regulation may be perceived as aloof or as too laid back. The facet of impulse control concerns the extent to which one thinks before they act and whether one gives in to their urges or take hasty decisions. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on impulse control. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low scores on impulse control have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals with high impulse control may have an inability to handle emergencies or to suffer from what is colloquially known as analysis paralysis. In trait emotional intelligence theory, the facet of relationships is about confidence in forging and maintaining fulfilling relationships with those who are close to us. More often than not, this concerns family and friends, although it may occasionally extend to include certain co-workers or associates. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on the facet of relationships. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low scores on the facet of relationships have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals with high scores on this facet may become overly dependent on their loved ones. The self-esteem facet of trait emotional intelligence is about our self-evaluations, how we evaluate ourselves, including our abilities, our achievements, and other important aspects of our lives. This is a slide with the correlates and characteristics of high and low self-esteem scores. Like all other trait EI facets, both high and low self-esteem have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, high self-esteem people may be seen as arrogant or may have difficulty acting on feedback. The trait emotional intelligence facet of self-motivation involves the extent to which a person is intrinsically motivated. That means being motivated from within rather than from external factors like money or awards. This is a slide with the correlates and characteristics of high and low self-motivation scores. Like all other trait EI facets, both high and low self-motivation have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, high self-motivation individuals may have a poor work-life balance. In trait emotional intelligence, the social awareness facet is about dealing with other people, socializing with them, negotiating with them, influencing them. It is a mainly interpersonal facet relating to social confidence. This is the slide with the correlates and characteristics of high and low social awareness scores. Like all other trait EI facets, both high and low social awareness have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, highly socially aware people may experience difficulties completing tasks in relative isolation. The stress management facet in trait emotional intelligence is about how well we believe we can manage pressure and stress in our lives. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on stress management. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low scores on stress management have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals who score high in stress management may be perceived as, or may actually be, indifferent or apathetic in challenging situations. The empathy facet of trait emotional intelligence focuses mainly on perspective taking rather than sympathy. Are you good at understanding other people's viewpoints and feelings? This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low empathy scores. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low empathy have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, high empathy individuals may show an excessive preoccupation with other people's viewpoints. Trait EI happiness involves positive emotions in the present period. It is different from the facet of optimism, which involves expectations about the future, whereas views of the past can be captured by a term like life satisfaction. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low happiness scores. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low happiness have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals with high scores on happiness may be perceived as frivolous or happy-go-lucky. The facet of optimism concerns positive expectations about the future, in contrast to that of happiness, which concerns positive emotions in the current period. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low optimism scores. Like all trait emotional intelligence facets, both high and low optimism have advantages as well as disadvantages. For example, individuals with high optimism may be seen as unrealistic. This concludes the first part of the video. Now, let's move on to part 2. This slide shows the hierarchical structure of trait emotional intelligence, with the 15 narrow facets at the bottom, 4 broad factors in the middle, and global trait emotional intelligence at the apex of the hierarchy. The broad factor of emotionality comprises the facets of emotion perception, emotion expression, relationships, and empathy. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on the trait EI factor of emotionality. Just like the trait emotional intelligence facets, all 4 trait EI factors can have advantages as well as disadvantages for both high and low scorers. For example, individuals with low scores on the emotionality factor are unlikely to have an unwarranted fixation on feelings and moods. The broad trait EI factor of self-control comprises the facets of emotion control, impulse control, and stress management. This slide shows some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on the trait EI factor of self-control. Just like the trait emotional intelligence facets, all 4 trait EI factors can have advantages as well as disadvantages for both high and low scorers. For example, individuals with low scores on the self-control factor of trait EI may be more spontaneous and able to act swiftly in emergency situations. The broad trait EI factor of sociability comprises the facets of assertiveness, emotion management, and social awareness. Here are some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on the trait EI factor of sociability. Just like the trait emotional intelligence facets, all 4 trait EI factors can have advantages as well as disadvantages for both high and low scorers. For example, individuals with high scores on the sociability factor of trait EI may be unsuitable for careers and jobs that require relative isolation. The broad trait EI factor of well-being comprises the facets of self-esteem, happiness, and optimism. Here are some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on the trait EI factor of well-being. Just like the trait emotional intelligence facets, all 4 trait EI factors can have advantages as well as disadvantages for both high and low scorers. For example, individuals with low scores on the well-being factor may well be more interested in improving themselves and less likely to be complacent. This is global trait emotional intelligence. It sits on the apex of the hierarchy and represents the most general level of the construct. Here are some correlates and characteristics of high and low scores on global trait emotional intelligence. High and low scores on global trait EI potentially have advantages as well as disadvantages. Let's look at a slightly more detailed interpretation of high and low scores on global trait emotional intelligence. Individuals with high scores on global trait emotional intelligence are virtually always well adapted on a surface level. On the negative side, they are significantly more likely to have an inflated idea about themselves and their capabilities. In a nutshell, average trait EI scores indicate an average level of satisfaction with your emotional functioning. An average global trait EI score can be arrived at through limited variation at the facet and factor levels, or through averaging many high and low scores at the facet and factor levels. These 2 different pathways have different implications. Individuals with low scores on global trait EI hold generally negative perceptions about their emotional world. These are liable to spill over into many other areas of their lives and to predispose them to mental health conditions. On the positive side, such individuals are not narcissistic, and they are also better placed as well as more likely to accomplish inner development work. This completes the second part of this video. We now move to the final part of this presentation, which looks at trait emotional intelligence as a psychological theory and general framework of interpretation. Trait emotional intelligence theory is far more general than other emotional intelligence models, which is reflected in the far greater attention it is receiving in the scientific literature. Trait emotional intelligence theory is testable, falsifiable, and general. In that sense, it represents a much more scientific proposition compared to the various quote-unquote models inundating commercial settings. From a theoretical perspective, the theory of trait emotional intelligence has decisive advantages that translate into tangible practical benefits in many different contexts. Trait AI theory acknowledges the inherently subjective nature of emotional experience instead of attempting to treat the entire domain of emotions as an offshoot of IQ. Trait emotional intelligence theory integrates the construct with existing theories of psychology. Specifically with respect to personality psychology, along with distinguished colleagues, we published research in the major journal Psychological Bulletin showing that trait emotional intelligence is in fact the fundamental personality dimension out of which all other personality dimensions, such as the Big Five, gradually emerge. Trait emotional intelligence theory extends way beyond a single model or measure. It is quite a general theory that can itself be integrated into even more general conceptions, such as radix intelligence, and finally, into the ultimate system of psychobionomy. And this concludes the presentation on trait emotional intelligence. Thank you for watching.